On Sunday afternoon, March 12, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zmetis Jr. drove his ATV across a frozen lake in Freedom, New Hampshire. And even though it was really cold and the air burned his cheeks and his lungs, Mike smiled as he drove. He really just loved it here. Most of the time, Mike lived 2 hours away in the town of Wakefield, Massachusetts. But he'd been coming to Freedom, New Hampshire for years because his parents had a vacation house here. And so this tiny lakeside community had always felt like a second home and a peaceful retreat. And Mike had recently bought his own vacation house in Freedom, just down the street from his parents. And the purchase had been a really big deal for him. He ran a cement contracting company called Allstate Concrete Pumping, and he'd worked really hard for many years to build up a nice life for his wife Michelle and their 3 kids. And in many ways, the purchase of the second house was proof that he'd done it. But his work with the concrete company had also created some issues in his marriage. Being in charge of a company meant a lot of responsibility and long hours. So Michelle and the kids were on their own quite a bit, which meant Michelle had to do most of the parenting and most of the household stuff. And she'd recently made it clear that Mike being gone all the time, despite how successful he was still really hard on her. Now, out on the lake, as Mike was kind of thinking about his whole life, Mike could see another ATV coming toward him. And as it got closer, he could see that the driver of the ATV was the other problem in his marriage, Sean Fitzpatrick. So Sean was one of their neighbors on the lake, and he'd been a close friend of the family for years. He was retired, and he lived in Freedom year-round, and when the Zmetis were there, he'd come over for dinners or barbecues or to take their kids boating out on the lake. He was around so much that Mike's kids actually called him Uncle Sean. But last summer, Mike had found out that his wife Michelle had cheated on him with Sean. Mike had been obviously completely devastated, but he and Michelle had both agreed not to give up on their marriage and had been going to therapy together ever since. And in terms of Mike and Sean's relationship, well, Mike still hadn't actually spoken to Sean since finding out about the affair, because mostly he just hated confrontation. It had been easier for him to avoid Sean and focus on rebuilding his relationship with Michelle. So seeing Sean now made Mike want to just turn around and speed off in the other direction. But Mike could see that Sean was already waving him down, so he came to a stop and waited there as Sean pulled his ATV up. And Sean did not beat around the bush. He immediately told Mike that he was glad he ran into him here because he'd been wanting to apologize about last summer and Michelle. It obviously wasn't okay, and he hoped they could just, put it behind them. And Mike, he was so surprised by how sincere Sean was being that he just said, you know what, that's all good. Which he didn't mean, because it definitely was not okay. But again, Mike's not a confrontational guy. All Mike really wanted to do here was get out of this interaction and get away from Sean, because this made him really uncomfortable. And also, he genuinely did need to leave basically right now, because he and Michelle and the kids were getting ready to head back to Wakefield soon, and he wanted to go help Michelle pack up. And so pretty quickly, Mike told Sean that he really had to go here. And then before, Sean could protest, Mike turned his ATV around and he gunned it back across the lake towards his house. About 15 minutes later, Mike walked into his house, and the first thing he saw was a bunch of suitcases all packed and sitting by the door. And he realized that, Michelle had already done all the work. But seconds later, Michelle came in and gave Mike a kiss. And she said, the kids were just finishing up cleaning their rooms and they could all head out in a few minutes. And then Mike heard the sound of a car beeping twice outside. And when he and his wife heard that, Michelle kind of rolled her eyes and laughed, because they both knew it was clearly Mike's parents. His parents had also been in Freedom for this weekend at their house down the street, and they were also making the 2-hour drive back to Wakefield this afternoon. And Michelle was laughing because it amused her that neither Mike nor his father could manage to go a single day without talking to each other. So Mike's dad was also named Michael, and the name was not the only thing they shared. They were also best friends and co-workers. Michael Sr. owned the company that Mike ran, Allstate Concrete, so it was like a family operation, and Mike Jr. had never even thought of doing anything else. He jumped into the concrete business right out of high school, and he and his dad had been working together ever since. Now, the Allstate Concrete Company had some struggles, just like any company would, including a lawsuit from a former employee that had been pretty stressful. But for the most part, the business was a huge success, and right now they were busier than ever, working on an enormous construction project in nearby Boston. So Mike headed outside to say hi to his parents and to talk a little business with his dad. He He asked Mike Sr. if he'd called their employee, Chester Roberts, yet, because Mike and his dad had plans to be at the office first thing tomorrow morning, and Mike wanted Chester to be there too. Chester worked part-time for them as a driver and also handyman, and he was easily the most reliable employee that they had. So whenever they had a packed week ahead, they always called Chester in. And to Mike Jr.'s relief, Mike Sr. said yes, he'd already spoken to Chester, and they were good to go. So eventually, they all said their goodbyes, and Mike Jr. told his dad he would see him tomorrow. Just before 8 a.m. the next morning, Monday, March 13th, Mike Jr. pulled his truck into the parking lot of Allstate Concrete. He was right on time. He could see he was the first vehicle there, so he got out and hustled across the lot because it was raining, and he unlocked a side door by one of the garage doors. So the Allstate building was basically just a massive garage with 3 huge roll-up doors for their cement trucks to pull into. But it also had an upstairs office where Mike and his father did all their administrative work. And so after Mike went in through the side door into the big garage, he headed up a set of steps that led to his office on the 2nd level. And when he got there, he sat in his desk chair and started going over the week's logistics. And just a few minutes later, he heard another vehicle pull into the lot outside. Mike figured that very likely this was his father, because Chester often came to the office on foot. Then Mike Jr. heard the downstairs door open and footsteps coming up the stairs. A few minutes later, Mike's father, Mike Sr., pulled his truck into the Allstate Concrete parking lot and parked next to his son's truck. He hopped out and walked quickly to the building's side door to get out of the rain, but when he tried to push open the side door, it got stuck on something and wouldn't open all the way. So he looked through the crack to see what was blocking the door, and he froze, because there was clearly a man lying face down inside of the building in a huge pool of blood. Now, it was dark inside the building, and so Michael Sr. could not see the man's face. He had no idea who this guy was. But whoever it was, he knew sort of instinctively that it was not his son. Mike Jr. was a big guy, and even in the dark, it was clear this man had a different build. And so Michael Sr.'s heart was pounding now, and all he could think to do was just back away, grab his cell phone, and call 911. However, after Michael Sr. got off the phone with the dispatcher and they said they were sending people over now, Mike Sr. realized he couldn't just wait for the police to get there. I mean, there was clearly someone either very badly hurt or dead in his garage, and his son was likely somewhere inside too. I mean, his truck was here, and so he had to go in and make sure his son was okay. So Michael Sr. walked away from the blocked door where he had been standing when he called the police, and he pulled up one of the big roll-up garage doors. And once it was open, he didn't see anyone. He just ran inside and began frantically screaming his son's name. But Mike Jr. didn't answer, and there was no sign of him anywhere. So eventually, Mike Sr. ran to the staircase and went up to the 2nd floor office. And as soon as Mike Sr. barged into the office, he stopped in horror, because there, sitting slumped in the desk chair, was the blood-covered body of his son. Over an hour later, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled up in front of Allstate Concrete. He could see the large building was already roped off with caution tape, and there were a dozen or more crime scene techs and officers with the Wakefield Police Department who were moving in and out of an open garage door collecting evidence. So Baker was not a part of the Wakefield Police Department. He was with the state police. But in Massachusetts, state troopers conduct homicide investigations right alongside local authorities. And Baker had a feeling that this case would definitely need his help, because Wakefield, they didn't get many homicides. The town was about 10 miles north of Boston and had a reputation as being a really peaceful and safe place, the kind of small town where everyone actually knew each other. Baker got out of his cruiser and looked around for whoever was in charge. And he didn't have to wait long, because an officer hurried up to him and introduced himself as Detective Richard Cass with the Wakefield Police Department. Cass told Baker to follow him, and as they walked towards the open garage door, he quickly briefed Baker up on the situation. There were 2 male victims inside, and both were deceased. They'd both been shot, and they had been found by the company's owner, Michael Zmetis Sr., a little after 8 a.m. Baker followed Cass into the garage and over to the first body, which was face down on the floor just inside a smaller side door. Cass explained that this victim was 51-year-old Chester Roberts, a part-time truck driver for Allstate. It hadn't been difficult to identify him because Chester did a lot of handiwork around town and was known by all the locals, including Detective Cass himself. When Baker went to the body, he could tell right away that Chester had been shot in the back. It was a single shot, and most likely was from a shotgun, since clearly there was a blast radius where there was like a spray effect with a lot of little pellets that entered his body. Chester had no other visible injuries, including no defensive injuries. And when Baker stood and looked around the garage, he also didn't see anything that pointed to a robbery or any kind of struggle. There was pretty pricey looking equipment just sitting around, and nothing was toppled over or obviously out of place. So Baker guessed that Chester's killer had likely snuck up on him and shot him in the back before he even had a chance to turn around. Baker spent a couple more minutes looking around at the doors and the windows, and again, didn't see any signs of, forced entry or anything out of the ordinary, but that didn't mean much. Chester had likely opened up for the day and begun work, and the killer had just come in after him. And so after a few minutes, when Baker was done looking around the first floor, he told Cass he was ready to go up to the second floor to see the second body. Moments later, Cass led Baker into the second floor office, where the body of 39-year-old Mike Zmetis Jr. had been found. Detective Cass said sadly that, just like with Chester, he knew Mike personally as well. Mike Jr. had not just been shot in the torso the way Chester had been shot. He had been shot in the face as well as in the chest. And the force of these shots had been so powerful that, like, his desk and surrounding paperwork were also all drenched in blood. And for the most part, Mike was basically unrecognizable. But what struck Baker the most was not just how gruesome this was. It was the fact that, Mike Jr. is still kind of slumped in his chair. He's in his office. Whoever did this, it's like they went in here to execute Mike, really intentionally. They marched in here, they didn't touch anything else, and they shot Mike right in the face with a shotgun before Mike could even get up. I mean, this seemed very intentional. Somebody came here to kill Mike. And so as Baker was thinking about that, he realized that this likely meant Mike Jr. was the one who actually got shot first, before Chester had even arrived at the building. Otherwise, Mike Jr. would have heard the gunshot downstairs, and he wouldn't have been so caught off guard sitting in his chair like this. And so again, if Mike was the first person shot, it just further suggested that he was the main target of this attack. The crime scene, of course was gruesome, but considering it was remarkably clean. I mean, there were no bloody footprints or any indication the killer had interacted with the scene. And the Zmetis did fit the mafia stereotype, an Italian-American family involved in construction. Baker told Cass what he was thinking, sort of as he was surveying the scene here. And Cass, as he heard this, he sort of had this thoughtful look come over his face. He said he knew the Zmetis pretty well, and Mike Jr. and his father were really good people. So he found it hard to believe they were involved in any kind of shady, mafia business deals. But he conceded that it was possible, especially since the Zmetis were contractors on a project called The Big Dig. And this made Baker immediately raise his eyebrows. So The Big Dig was literally the biggest construction project in the country and involved building a tunnel under the harbor in Boston. But it had been kind of like a total disaster, just a major headache for the city since it was way over budget and had been going on for 15 years and still wasn't done. This huge project had also been famously hampered by mafia dealings and corrupt payoffs. So now Baker had to wonder if the Zmetis had either been involved in these seedy deals or had maybe accidentally upset the wrong person while on the job. But even if the murders had nothing to do with the mob, Baker still thought it was very likely that the killer was somehow connected to their business. Somebody who maybe had worked at Allstate Concrete, or maybe who had been a client, and would know where Mike worked in the building, and that he'd be there early in the morning. And while the second victim, Chester, was probably not the primary target, Baker wasn't sure yet why he was also killed. He could have been killed because he was just at work at the wrong moment, or maybe he was wrapped up in the same conflict as the Zmetis. So for a moment, Baker just stood there staring at the scene, staring at the blood-soaked paperwork all over the desk. And then eventually he turned to Cass and said they would need a list of all of Allstate's employees and clients. Baker then spent some more time just kind of walking around the office looking for evidence, and he noticed a 16-gauge shotgun shell on the floor. So he grabbed a nearby tech and told her to bag it and see if she could locate any other shells. Baker and Cass then headed outside, where already a crowd of people were gathering outside around the outside of the police perimeter. Once they were outside, Trooper Baker asked Cass if they could start by speaking with the person who actually discovered the bodies, Michael Zmetis Sr. But Detective Cass shook his head and said no. He explained when he'd first gotten to the scene that Michael Sr. had been so distraught over his son's death that he could barely speak, so Cass had just sent him home. Another Wakefield police officer had done the same thing when Mike Jr.'s wife, Michelle Zmetis, showed up, totally hysterical, saying she had heard there was an accident, and they had told her that her husband was dead and taken her home too. Baker understood, but was not thrilled to hear this. He preferred to speak to witnesses and family really quickly and in person. In a murder, a spouse is always a suspect, so he was especially disappointed to have missed Michelle. But there was still plenty to do at the scene, and obviously the Wakefield police knew where the family could be found later. So Baker turned to Cass and suggested they just start canvassing the businesses nearby. The following morning, March 14th, Trooper Baker parked his car in front of Mike's parents' house in Wakefield. He was with Detective Cass, and they were there to speak with Mike Sr. They'd just gotten the autopsies back for both Chester and Mike, but they didn't reveal anything that they didn't already know. Chester had been shot once, Mike twice, and both died likely within seconds. But the investigators did have one potential lead from their canvass of the neighborhood. Even though they hadn't found any surveillance cameras at Allstate Concrete, some businesses around Allstate had some. So Baker had some officers scrubbing through that footage now. He also had another team interviewing Chester Roberts' family, because there was still a chance that Baker had gotten this all wrong and maybe Chester was actually the target. Besides that, the crime techs had not found much physical evidence at the scene. There were no fingerprints, and since it had been raining, they hadn't been able to collect any footprints or car tracks from outside. So now, Baker reached up and knocked on the front door of the Zmetis house, hoping that Mike Sr. would be able to point them in the right direction. A minute later, Baker and Cass sat in the living room with Mike Sr. and Pat, Mike's mom. Both of Mike's parents seemed incredibly emotional. Michael Sr. was visibly shaking, while Pat just cried. And seeing how upset they were now made Baker realize that Cass had made the right call in sending Michael Sr. home yesterday. Even 24 hours later, it was still going to be very hard to get any sort of real answer out of them because of how upset they were. So Baker decided he would just have to keep it really brief. The first thing he did is he asked Mike Sr. to just go over the actual discovery of the bodies. Tell me what happened. And what he said lined up with everything that Baker had heard from Cass and from dispatch. And so after Mike Sr. went over that, Baker moved on to the real reason he was there. He asked if there was anybody in Mike Jr.'s life who might have wanted to hurt him. Mike Sr. took a few shaky breaths as he thought about the question, and then he said that, there were a few people in the industry that he and his son did not necessarily get along with, but mostly they tried to have good relationships with everyone. Getting in fights was just bad business. But as he was saying this, Mike Sr. suddenly sat up straighter, like he just thought of something. And he said, actually, there was a former coworker who did definitely have a grudge against them. His nephew, Hank Jennings. Hank got mad at them a few years ago about unpaid overtime wages and actually filed a lawsuit against them. Now, they'd eventually paid Hank a settlement, but they still all hated each other. Mike Sr. looked over at his wife, Pat, and she just nodded and said the whole thing had been really high stress and very volatile. Baker took down Hank's information and talked with Mike's parents for just a few more minutes, and then he nodded to Cass, and they stood to leave. Baker knew he still needed to speak more to the Zmetis, but for now, he was going to give them a break, and instead, he and Cass would look into Hank. 2 days later, Baker sat in Cass's office at the Wakefield Police Department, poring over crime scene photos and witness statements. He was starting to get antsy. After meeting with Mike's parents, he'd been excited to speak with Hank Jennings, the disgruntled former employee who also happened to be Mike's cousin. But even though Baker and Cass had sent officers out to track Hank down for an interview, they hadn't been able to get a hold of him yet. However, they had gotten in touch with Mike's wife, Michelle, and had questioned her at her house in Wakefield, but she hadn't given them much. She said that she was at home with her kids at the time of her husband's death, and that she really didn't know of anybody who would want to hurt Mike Jr. Also, Baker and Cass had looked into Allstate Concrete's financial statements, and they had found nothing that suggested there was anything shady or mafia-related happening with the company. Still, Baker knew they were better off than they had been a few days ago, primarily because they had had a chance to review a bunch of the surveillance footage from the businesses around Allstate, and one of those security cameras had been aimed at the street right outside Allstate. Now, this angle didn't show the Allstate parking lot itself, but it did show everyone who entered and exited that parking lot from the street. So, this particular camera had picked up Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m., and then at 7:44 a.m., so 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck pulled in as well. And then a few minutes after that, Chester Roberts was seen arriving at Allstate on foot. And then at 7:50, the green truck was seen again, leaving the parking lot, 12 minutes before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02. So, whoever the killer was, it looked like they had driven that green truck and had killed Mike and Chester between 7:44 a.m. and 7:50 a.m. The video wasn't clear enough to show the driver of this mysterious green truck or even see its plates, and it didn't actually show the driver of this vehicle, the killer, getting out of the vehicle and entering the building. But knowing the style and color of very likely the killer's vehicle would definitely help them narrow down potential suspects. Just then, the desk phone rang, and Baker watched as Cass grabbed it and said hello. And then Cass got a confused look on his face before he thanked the caller and said they'd be right over. He hung up and told Baker that was Michelle Zmetis, and she'd called to say that she had new information to give them, something that she hadn't mentioned in her first interview, and that it was really important. About 15 minutes later, Baker and Cass sat down across from Michelle in her living room for the second time. And to Baker, Michelle seemed very different from the last time they spoke. 2 days ago, she'd seemed horrified and grief-stricken. But now, she just seemed really nervous. She kept touching her hair and fiddling with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table. Baker commented that there were a lot of cards, and Michelle just nodded. She said so many people had reached out and sent cards, all their friends and neighbors in Wakefield and in Freedom, New Hampshire, where their second home was. And then Michelle took a breath and just got straight to the reason that she had called them. She said that she had withheld information about one of her neighbors in Freedom. His name was Sean Fitzpatrick, and she'd had an affair with him. Baker cleared his throat in surprise and then asked her to go on. Michelle's eyes filled with tears as she explained how Mike Jr. worked so much and she and the kids spent a lot of time at their lake house, and so that meant they spent a lot of time with Sean. And eventually this friendship between Michelle and Sean had grown into a romance. Baker couldn't believe he was hearing this. A secret love triangle gave both Sean and Michelle plenty of motivation to want Mike dead. But before he could ask any follow-up questions, Michelle said her husband actually knew all about her affair, and that they had been in therapy, and they'd begun to completely turn their marriage around. So finally, a month ago, she'd officially totally broken things off with Sean, and Sean had been really upset about it. Baker shared a look with Cass and could tell they were both thinking the same thing. Obviously, they needed to speak to Sean immediately. But also, Michelle was now back to being a primary suspect too. Maybe she had wanted her husband out of the picture so she could be with Sean, and maybe the only reason she was telling them this was to get ahead of it. However, they would need a lot more evidence before they could prove any of that. So for now, Baker just got Sean's number and address from Michelle and told her they would be in touch. Later that night, Baker and Cass were once again inside of Cass's office, but this time they were there with another officer who was there to give them a crucial update. After speaking with Michelle, Baker had sent a team of officers up to Freedom, New Hampshire to speak with Sean, the neighbor she had been having an affair with. And now, one of those officers was back in Wakefield to tell them what he had learned. And the first thing Baker wanted to know was not about their conversation. It was just, did you see a green truck in Sean's driveway? But the officer shook his head and said Sean did own a truck, but it was bright red. Then he went on to say that when they had spoken to Sean, he had completely denied having an affair with Michelle. Sean had admitted that he had dated a lot of girls, but he'd insisted that he and Michelle were just close family friends. Now, the officers who were there speaking to Sean just stood there and let Sean talk, never telling him that they already knew that Michelle fully admitted to them having an affair, and they knew Sean was lying here. Baker almost laughed when he heard this, because he did not believe Sean at all. And if he was lying like he appeared to be, that made him seem pretty guilty. But before he could say so, the officer added one more thing. He said Sean actually had a solid alibi. He'd been at home on the morning of the murders, and one of his neighbors had actually confirmed it. This particular neighbor took her morning walk every day at 9 a.m., and she'd seen Sean outside his house right around then. Baker sighed. It took around 2 hours to drive between Freedom and Wakefield, so Sean would not have had enough time to kill Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. and then get to Freedom by 9. And so suddenly, Sean Fitzpatrick felt like another very promising dead end. On March 18th, so 5 days after the murders of Mike Zmetis and Chester Roberts, Detectives Baker and Cass stood at the back of a church in Wakefield, Massachusetts. They were there for Mike's funeral, and the church was absolutely packed. But the investigators were not just there to pay their respects. They were also there to speak to Hank Jennings, the cousin of Mike who had filed that lawsuit against the concrete company. Since by that point they still had not been able to officially get a hold of Hank, Cass had suggested that they just corner him at Mike's funeral, which he was very likely to attend because, despite his rift with the Zmetis, he was still family. And when the service wrapped up and everybody stood to leave, Baker felt a nudge on his arm. Cass leaned over and whispered that they'd been right, and he pointed out Hank right in the crowd. So, as the attendees started filing out of the church, the investigators pushed their way over to Hank and got in front of him just before he could step outside. Baker immediately noticed that Hank's whole body went tense when they blocked his way, like he wanted to try to make a run for it. So Baker just cut to the chase, and he said, "Hank, will you come with us and speak to us, please?" And Hank's eyes got really wide, and he just said, "No way, not without his lawyer." Then he pushed past the investigators and hurried outside. Baker and Cass didn't follow him. Instead, they just exchanged a look, because they knew now that Hank was obviously their primary suspect. 5 weeks after the funeral, in mid-April of 2006, State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office in the Wakefield Police Department. He was wearing gloves, and he was holding a piece of paper that looked like an old-fashioned ransom note. It was covered in letters that had been clearly cut out of a newspaper, and it spelled out a very alarming message. "Close business now, or more family will die." This message had been brought to them by Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat, who said they had received it in the mail that morning. For the Zmetis, for so many reasons, this letter was terrifying. It was not just a reminder of their son's murder, but also a promise that there would be more violence. But for Baker, the note was a lead, which they really needed, because it had been over a month since Michael and Chester were killed, and at this point, the two investigators had managed to rule out basically every one of their suspects, and that included Hank Jennings. They'd learned that Hank's clear reluctance to meet with them was not because of guilt. It was because he had signed a non-disclosure agreement during the settlement with the Zmetis and didn't want to break it. And when they did finally speak to him, he clearly had an alibi. He was at work when Mike and Chester were killed, and Baker and Cass had confirmed it with his employer. And while Hank did own some shotguns, none of them were 16 gauge. So Hank joined the pile of other discarded suspects, like Michelle, who could have had the motive to kill Mike Jr. since she was wrapped up in an affair with their neighbor, but she'd been incredibly cooperative, and they hadn't been able to find any evidence that she might have been involved, like maybe if she had hired someone or something. And her ex-lover, Sean, was also very suspicious and had a strong motive to kill Mike, but his alibi had cleared him. There was no way Sean could have been in Wakefield during the murders because his neighbor saw him about an hour later at his home, which was over 100 miles away. And so now this warning note that looked like a ransom note seemed to point back towards the theory that Baker and Cass had ruled out at the very beginning, that the murders were business-related and the mafia was involved. Cass was a local, and he'd told Baker that there had been a lot of rumors swirling around about the murders in the community. Because of the Zmetis' role in the Big Dig, the general consensus around Wakefield was that the mob theory made the most sense. But Baker really wasn't so sure. I mean, they'd looked into the Zmetis' books and records repeatedly, and they hadn't seen anything to suggest any shady deals or potential mob interaction. Also, Baker didn't think this ransom-style note made from newspaper clippings was the mob style. It just felt kind of silly and performative. Like maybe somebody was trying to make it seem like the mob to lead the investigation in the wrong direction. But even if that was the case, this note was still huge, because maybe whoever had sent it had left their fingerprints or DNA on it. So Baker bagged up the note, and Cass carried it off to send to the crime lab. Baker knew the results from the lab would not be immediate, so while they waited, he wanted to re-interview all their suspects and all their witnesses in case they'd overlooked anything. A few days later, Baker sat alone at Cass's desk reading another witness statement. He'd been revitalized by all the new evidence they'd gathered and was feeling really optimistic about their ability to solve this thing. Aside from conducting new interviews, they had gotten some forensics from that ransom letter. The lab had found both DNA and a palm print on it. Now, they just needed a suspect to compare it to. And just then, the office door flung open and a very excited Cass barged in. An hour later, Baker and Cass walked up the front steps at Michelle Zmetis' house, and they knocked on her front door. When she answered, they asked her for permission to come inside and take a certain small object from her house. And after Michelle, who was sort of confused by what they were asking for, said, "Okay, come on in," they went right past her, went straight to this object, they bagged it, went right back outside, and sent it off to the crime lab. And as soon as the lab test results came back, Baker and Cass knew they had solved the case. Based on DNA, other forensic evidence, and witness statements, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael Zmetis Jr. and Chester Roberts on the morning of March 13th, 2006. At 7:45 a.m., the killer crept up the stairs that led to Mike's office. They had a shotgun with them, and their heart was racing. They were very nervous about what they were about to do. But Mike Jr., he had to go, and that was all there was to it. So when the killer reached the office door, they barely hesitated before pushing it open and raising their shotgun. Mike was sitting in a chair at his desk, and when the door opened, he turned towards the killer. And when Mike Jr. saw them standing there with a gun pointed at them, his eyes got wide, but the killer fired 2 blasts before Mike could even move, hitting Mike in the face and in the chest. Mike immediately slumped over in his seat and stopped moving, and the killer ran back down the stairs to the garage. But before they could leave, they froze, because they could hear footsteps approaching the building's side door from outside. And so the killer instinctively just hid, not really sure what they were going to do, waiting for this person to either come inside or leave. And then once this person did come inside, it was a man, it was Chester, the killer leapt out and shot him right in the back, and he dropped to the ground, dead. And after killing Chester, the killer felt shocked. I mean, they hadn't planned on killing a second person today. Mike was the target. But they also knew they couldn't just wait around for more people to arrive. So the killer at this point left the building and jumped into the truck they had stolen from one of their neighbors. Then they peeled out of the parking lot less than just 10 minutes after they'd arrived. As they drove, they gripped the wheel tightly, and they knew they should feel guilty about what they had just done. But instead, all they felt was relief, because now they could finally be with the love of their life. It would turn out Michael Zmetis Jr. and Chester Roberts were not murdered by Mike's wife Michelle, or Mike Jr.'s cousin Hank, or the mob. They were killed by Mike Jr.'s lakeside neighbor and his wife's lover, Sean Fitzpatrick. When Michelle tried to break things off with Sean, she said the only reason she would ever leave Mike was if Mike ended things, or if something happened to him. Now, Michelle meant that as an excuse, but Sean took it as a suggestion. So then he murdered Mike Jr. to steal his wife. Sean took that green pickup truck from a neighbor who was out of town, and then drove it to Wakefield, committed the murders, and then came back. That neighbor who said they saw Sean at his house in Freedom at around 9 a.m. that basically made it impossible for Sean, based on timing, to have gone, committed the murders, and came back. Well, that neighbor called to amend their statement, saying that actually they had seen Sean later in the day. And that change created enough time, enough of a window on the day of the murders, that it was absolutely possible that Sean could have driven, done the murders, and come back. And so once Sean's alibi fell apart, investigators remembered that stack of condolence cards at Michelle's house. So they went over to see if maybe Sean had sent one. And he had. And when they tested the envelope flap, which he had licked to seal it, they got his DNA. Then they matched it to the very threatening letter that sort of looked like a ransom letter that had been given to the Zmetis, which Sean had put together and sent to them in order to throw police off his trail and make them think that, yeah, the mob was involved here. In June of 2006, Sean Fitzpatrick was arrested and eventually received 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Michael Zmetis Jr. and Chester Roberts. Sheena Bora walked through the big iron gates of St. Xavier's College in Mumbai, India, and looked up in awe at the grand cathedral-like buildings that rose up all around her. It was July 2006, and it was Sheena's first day of college. The 19-year-old had worked hard all through high school, even taking extra classes in the evenings to make sure she remained at the top of her class. Her favorite subjects were math and science, and so at St. Xavier's, she had decided to major in economics, which is a subject that includes elements of both math and science. On this July day, Sheena wore leggings under a flowing deep blue top that covered her shoulders, in keeping with St. Xavier's strict dress code. But even dressed modestly, Sheena was very beautiful. She had long dark hair, big brown eyes, and a wide, sweet smile. But she was shy and nervous, and she didn't know anyone at the school yet, so to avoid any awkward interactions with new people, she intentionally walked quickly and kept her eyes looking straight ahead. As she hustled deeper into the sprawling campus, Sheena passed through a garden with palm and mango and papaya trees, and then she walked under a graceful stone arch engraved with the name of the school. Just past that archway, Sheena checked in at the security desk, and then she turned right and walked toward the middle of the campus, which was an open plaza centered on a Gothic chapel with tall green stained glass windows. When she reached the place, Sheena stopped to look around. It was packed with students laughing and shouting, and for a second, she was overcome with amazement at where her life had taken her. Until just a few months earlier, Sheena had had little hope for her future. She was a poor girl from a crowded city called Guwahati, located almost 2,000 miles to the east of her new college. Her family counted every rupee, which is Indian money, and some nights dinner was just rice. But now, here she was at one of the very best colleges in India. St. Xavier's had everything: state-of-the-art computer labs, a library with more than 1 million books, and it even had its own museum. The school admitted only about 1,000 undergraduate students each year, and now Sheena was one of those lucky few. Sheena took one more look at all the people in the plaza and then started walking again. She crossed to the other side of the plaza and walked inside of a stone 4-story building. After going upstairs to the second floor, Sheena turned down a long white hallway, and when she reached the end of it, she saw a sign hanging over a door on the left-hand side that read Multimedia Room. This was where her first class was scheduled to be. Sheena opened the door and stepped inside, but it was empty. She was the first person to arrive. The room was huge, with high ceilings, brand new desks, and a big video screen down in front for the teacher to use. Sheena sat down at a desk in the front row. She pulled a notebook and pen out of her bag, and then after tucking the bag back under her seat, Sheena began to wait. After a few minutes, Sheena heard the door open behind her, and she turned around and saw other students starting to file inside. The room eventually filled up with more than 100 people, with almost every desk taken. Then, after all the students had arrived, the professor came in, walking quickly and swinging a briefcase. He walked down the middle aisle until he reached the front of the class, where he put his briefcase down on the table, he wrote his name on the whiteboard, then he turned to face the class. A few minutes after that, Sheena was furiously scribbling notes down and listening to her classmates ask and answer questions about economic theory. Sheena smiled. She loved college already. But even though her initial impression of college was a good one, Sheena knew it was going to take some time to get adjusted to her new life in Mumbai. It was already so much different than the life she had always known in Guwahati. But over the following days and weeks, Sheena would get more comfortable with her surroundings, and she would even muster the courage to start casual conversations with her new classmates. And it would turn out, despite her shy demeanor, Sheena's classmates were very much drawn to her. Sheena was a good listener, she was kind, and she worked incredibly hard. And in time, Sheena would have a little core group of friends that she shared notes with and ate lunch with at the campus cafe. And it wasn't just students that took a liking to Sheena. Her professors liked her as well. Sheena always went above and beyond on every assignment she was given. One time, when a class required data about a little rural town, Sheena actually traveled the 250 miles to the town to find the data herself instead of using old information posted online. But despite how well-liked Sheena was, there was something very odd about her that her classmates and her professors noticed about her almost immediately, and that was all the mysterious phone calls she got. Sheena would be sitting in one of her classes in her regular spot right up front, diligently taking notes and completely focused on the subject matter, and then her phone would vibrate. She'd reach down, rummage through her bag under her feet, and check to see who was calling, and there was one name that, if she saw it on her screen, would change Sheena's entire demeanor. She would instantly pack up her things, nod a quick, silent apology to her professor, and then rush out of the classroom without telling anyone what was going on. When her friends asked her about these calls, Sheena would just say that it was her older sister, Indrani, who was calling her, and that Indrani was just overprotective and sometimes needed Sheena to come home right away. Sheena's friends didn't really understand this, but when they tried to fish for more information, Sheena would just start acting uncomfortable and try to change the subject. In fact, Sheena never really talked about her family or personal life at all. Her friends could sense it was a painful topic, and they were right. What Sheena didn't share widely was that before she had come to Mumbai, her life was very troubled, and not just because her family did not have much money. When Sheena and her little brother Mikhail were just babies, their mother abandoned them. Sheena's mother had always dreamed of fame and riches, and so when she got the opportunity to go to a big city to study, she took it, leaving her kids behind. And so Sheena and her brother had grown up in a little house in a narrow alleyway with their grandparents. The grandparents had tried their best, but it was very hard. Mikhail had mental health issues, and Sheena was always sad because she missed her mother terribly. Sheena would write about her mother in her diary. Some days she would wonder about why her mother had not come back. Did she not love her children? Other days, Sheena would find herself dreaming of doing exactly what her mother had done, leaving and going to college in a big city. And it was Indrani, the overprotective older sister who always called in the middle of Sheena's classes, who had made Sheena's college dream come true. Indrani was about 15 years older than Sheena. She had left Guwahati years earlier, determined to make a better life for herself, and with her charm and fierce work ethic, she had done it. She was glamorous and beautiful, and just recently married to a man named Peter Mukherjee, who ran India's most successful TV network and who had been named one of India's 50 most powerful people. Indrani was a socialite, a businesswoman, and a media tycoon. Some people even called her the First Lady of Indian television. But no matter how famous and wealthy Indrani got, she never forgot about her little brother and sister back in Guwahati. And so finally, in 2006, Indrani came back to Guwahati and pulled her younger siblings out of poverty and away from their little house in the alley. Indrani sent Mikhail to a school in the south of India, and then to treatment for his mental health issues, and then she brought Sheena back west with her to Mumbai to go to school at St. Xavier's. So now, when Sheena's phone rang and she saw it was Indrani calling her, no matter where she was or what she was doing, she would always stop and answer that call. She felt like she owed that to her older sister for all she had done for her. When Sheena had first arrived in Mumbai, she lived for a while with Indrani and Indrani's husband, Peter, in their penthouse apartment in a luxury building in South Mumbai. But by late 2007, about 1 year into her time at St. Xavier's, Sheena had found a place of her own. A pretty little flat near her school in a neighborhood called Colaba, right on the Arabian Sea. And while Monday through Friday, Sheena stayed at school or her flat and focused exclusively on her schoolwork, she still found time every weekend to go visit with Indrani and Peter at their penthouse. And it was during one of those weekend visits that Sheena met the man who would forever change the course of her life. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon toward the end of 2007 during Mumbai's monsoon season when it rains almost continually for months. Sheena was sitting on her sister's couch reading a book when, from behind her, she heard the door to the penthouse open. And then she heard a young man's deep voice calling out a greeting to Indrani and Peter. Sheena folded the page of her book, laid it on her lap, and turned around. And there, standing in the doorway, greeting Indrani and Peter with hugs, was one of the most handsome men Sheena had ever seen. He was tall and athletic with dark eyes, high cheekbones, and slicked back jet black hair. He also had a faint British accent. To Sheena, he looked and sounded just like a movie star. His name was Rahul Mukherjee, and he was Peter's son from a previous marriage. Rahul had been living in the United Kingdom, but after getting dumped by his longtime girlfriend, who was upset that Rahul could not keep a steady job, Rahul had decided to return to Mumbai and try to make it in Bollywood. Bollywood is India's film industry. Rahul's plan was to live with Indrani and Peter in their penthouse until he could get established in show business, at which point he would move out on his own. Suddenly feeling a bit flustered, Sheena stood up and made her way over to the door to greet Rahul. When she got to the door, Rahul was bent over taking off his shoes, but when he stood back up and laid eyes on Sheena for the first time, he smiled a big wide smile, and Sheena smiled right back. From that very first interaction, there was a clear spark between Sheena and Rahul. Sheena started arriving at her sister's penthouse for her weekend visits earlier in the day and leaving later. Rahul, who normally liked to go out and party, always made sure he was home when he knew Sheena was coming by. They both loved Bollywood movies, and so they started watching them together in the afternoons. But although Sheena and Rahul obviously liked each other, they were careful not to let their attraction blossom into anything more than just a platonic friendship. They knew that Sheena's sister, Indrani, and Rahul's father, Peter, would frown on the two of them having any kind of romantic relationship. First of all, though they weren't related by blood and didn't meet until they were both adults, Rahul was still Indrani's stepson, which meant Sheena was technically Rahul's aunt, even though Rahul was actually 4 years older than Sheena. But even beyond the very awkward family dynamics, Sheena and Rahul were just two drastically different people. Rahul had grown up rich in England, he went to the best boarding schools in the United Kingdom, and he had never gone hungry a day in his life. He also had a bit of a wild streak in him. As a teenager, he got arrested for growing marijuana, and as an adult, he barely worked, choosing instead to live the high life using his parents' money. As for Sheena, she was hardworking, quiet, and came from nothing. Even at St. Xavier's, which had strict rules about how students could dress and behave, Sheena was considered to be very modest. In short, Sheena and Rahul were total opposites. And so, for the first 6 months that Rahul and Sheena knew each other, they kept a respectful distance between them. But then, one weekend afternoon in 2008, when Sheena and Rahul were alone in Indrani's penthouse, something happened. They sat down to watch another Bollywood movie, but this time, instead of sitting separately like usual, they curled up next to each other on the couch and pulled a blanket across their laps. And then, as the movie played, Sheena and Rahul leaned into each other and kissed. After that first kiss, Sheena and Rahul knew they could not keep pretending they didn't have romantic feelings for each other. And so they decided they would just have to date publicly and accept the fact that Indrani and Peter would most likely not be happy. And Sheena and Rahul were right about that. The young couple very quickly moved into an apartment together located about 20 minutes to the north of Indrani's penthouse. And pretty much the second they finished moving their things into this new apartment, the fighting began between the two couples. Or more specifically, Rahul began fighting with Indrani. Even though Indrani was Rahul's stepmother, he never liked her and certainly never loved her. His own parents' marriage had broken up because his father, Peter, cheated on his mother constantly with younger women who clearly were only interested in Peter for his money. And so Rahul had always viewed Indrani as nothing more than just another one of those types of women. And so very quickly after Rahul and Sheena had moved out, Rahul and Indrani began getting into these horrible yelling matches every time they saw each other. At one point, Indrani even tried to ban Peter from seeing Rahul. However, Peter would sneak out and see his son behind Indrani's back and make sure he had enough money. As Rahul and Indrani fought more and more, Sheena started to distance herself from Indrani and the rest of her family. Sheena also began adopting some of Rahul's worst habits, like blowing off responsibilities to stay out late and party, and at least one time, people saw Sheena and Rahul snorting cocaine together in a nightclub. But despite all the drama around their relationship, Sheena and Rahul remained a couple. and they were still a couple a few years later in 2011, when by that point, Sheena had managed to graduate from St. Xavier's, and she had managed to get a full-time job with Mumbai's metro train system. But despite Sheena and Rahul believing that at this point, their lives were going more or less the way they wanted them to be going, they were in for a shock. One fateful night was about to kick off a chain of events that would not only totally upend their lives, but it would also rock the country of India. That fateful night was October 26, 2011. It was the same day as the most important holiday of the year in India, Diwali, or the Festival of Lights. On Diwali, Indian people celebrate the triumph of light over darkness and good over evil. In Mumbai, the whole city seemed like it was glowing. Lights hung from all the trees and up and down the streets and in front of every home. That night, as fireworks exploded across the sky, Rahul dropped down on one knee inside of the apartment he and Sheena shared and asked Sheena to marry him. For her whole life, all Sheena really wanted was for someone to love her, and now she finally had that. Sheena was overjoyed and started crying happy tears and said yes. Little did she know, this decision would haunt her. Now that Sheena was engaged to Rahul, she felt like she needed to make an effort to try to repair her relationship with Indrani. So, Sheena wrote Indrani an email telling her she was sorry that they had fought so much over the years, and she said that life was just too short for them to be holding grudges. And Indrani, for her part, was reconsidering too. She and Peter were just tired of the constant conflicts with the young couple. And so, on March 10th, 2012, Indrani sent a response email to Sheena, and in this message, she told Sheena that she would always love her no matter how angry they got with each other. It wasn't long after sending that reply email that Indrani got a response from Sheena. And when Indrani read what Sheena wrote, she instantly felt this rush of fear and anxiety come over her. And so Indrani picked up her laptop and ran to find Peter. Once the couple was staring at the screen together, they both read Sheena's email in stunned silence. In the message, Sheena made it very clear that things had soured with Rahul, and now she desperately wanted out of the relationship, but she said she couldn't do it alone and needed Indrani's help. Over the next few weeks, all Indrani thought about was her little sister, Sheena, and how to save her from Rahul. Indrani checked in on Sheena regularly by email and text. At one point, she even offered to buy Sheena a diamond ring in hopes that might cheer her up. She also told Sheena that whenever she was open to it, Indrani was more than happy to get her set up in her very own 3-bedroom apartment. And while Indrani wished Sheena would agree to that, she knew this was a very sensitive situation, and so whatever Indrani did to help Sheena, it would need to be when Sheena agreed to let her do it. And so Indrani waited. On April 24th, 2012, a little more than a month after Sheena first asked for Indrani's help in that email, Sheena told Rahul that she was going out to meet her sister Indrani for dinner. Sheena asked Rahul to drop her off on Linking Road in Bandra, which is a famous shopping area in a fancy suburb of Mumbai, known for the huge and colorful variety of clothes and shoes and fashion accessories sold by street vendors. Rahul knew that Sheena was talking to her sister again, but because he was still on very bad terms with Indrani, he had actually tried to put a stop to it. But Sheena seemed desperate to make things right with her sister, so as much as Rahul disapproved, he did not try to convince Sheena not to go out and see Indrani for this dinner date. And so, at around 6 p.m. that evening, Rahul, somewhat begrudgingly, gave Sheena a ride from their flat to Linking Road. By 6:30 p.m., they had arrived at the bustling shopping center, and Rahul had pulled his car into a parking space. Sheena leaned over from the passenger seat and gave Rahul a kiss, and then opened her door and got out of the car. Rahul watched as Sheena started to walk into the crowd of shoppers, but then he saw her turn around to face him again. She was wearing a maroon top, jeans, dangly earrings, and her engagement ring, and she was carrying a purse. She smiled and told Rahul one more time that she loved him and that she would see him later. Then she pulled her purse strap up over her shoulder, turned around again, and started walking into the crowd. Rahul could see where she was going. In the middle of the crowd was this fancy silver sedan, where Indrani was sitting in the back seat. Rahul could see there was a man he didn't know leaning against the outside of the car smoking a cigarette, and Rahul figured that was Indrani's driver. He watched as Sheena arrived at the side of the car and bent down to look in the window and wave hello. Then Sheena pulled open the back left door, climbed inside, and shut the door behind her. At this point, the smoking man dropped his cigarette, put it out with the heel of his shoe, then climbed into the driver's side of the car. Rahul watched the silver sedan back up and then start to drive away, and after a few moments, he had lost sight of it in the big crowd. A few hours later, back at the flat he and Sheena shared, Rahul's phone buzzed. He picked it up and found a message from Sheena that said she was going to stay overnight with Indrani and she would see him in the morning. Rahul frowned at this message. He was already unhappy that Sheena and Indrani were rekindling their relationship, and he didn't like the idea of the two of them getting so close again so fast. He was also starting to feel suspicious that Indrani might try to break up the couple's engagement. The next morning, when Rahul woke up, he called Sheena, but she didn't answer. A little while later, though, she sent him a text message that said she would be home soon, so he relaxed and started going about his day. But about 45 minutes later, Rahul's phone buzzed again. He was standing in his kitchen making himself something to eat, and when he grabbed his phone off the counter and read this new message Sheena had sent him, his chest suddenly tightened and his face started getting hot. He dropped the knife he was holding and left his food on the counter, and then, while furiously texting a response to Sheena, he ran out of the flat and got into his car. Seconds later, he was peeling out of his parking spot and careening down the road. The text message that Sheena had sent Rahul that upset him so much was very simple. She had met someone else, and so she was breaking up with Rahul. She didn't respond to anything else Rahul texted her. As Rahul sped south towards Indrani's penthouse, Sheena and Indrani were on the road too, driving south out of Mumbai. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the back seat of Indrani's car. Their hair and makeup were perfect, and there were 2 suitcases packed in the trunk. Sheena's head rested on Indrani's shoulder. A few minutes later, Rahul arrived at Indrani's penthouse apartment, parked crookedly in a spot outside, and then got out of his car and slammed the door. He walked quickly towards the front door of the building, which was manned by a security guard. The guard knew Rahul and usually just said hello and waved him inside, but today he acted differently. Indrani had told the guard, along with the rest of her staff, that there might be some commotion soon and that they were not to let anyone into the penthouse, especially not Rahul. So when Rahul tried to walk past the guard stepped out from behind his desk, stood in front of Rahul, and shook his head, telling Rahul he was sorry, but he just couldn't go any further. Rahul stopped short. At first he was just confused, but his confusion quickly turned to anger. He knew Indrani had to be behind this. Rahul told the guard that he was just here to get his fiancée, but the guard continued to say, "I'm sorry, you can't come in." And so, with a very quick step to his left, Rahul darted around the guard and ran into the building. Rahul was able to get into the elevator car and shut the doors before the guard could catch up to him. Rahul rode the elevator up to the 5th floor, which was the floor of the building where Indrani and Peter lived. But when Rahul opened the door to their penthouse, it was quiet and empty inside. Starting to panic, Rahul rushed back outside into the elevator and rode down just 1 floor to the 2nd flat that Peter and Indrani owned. But when he let himself inside of that residence, the only person inside was a confused maid who said no one had been in there all day. Rahul stormed out, rode the elevator back down to the 1st floor, and walked back over to the guard who was back at his post, and immediately Rahul began demanding that the guard tell him who had been in the building and when. When the guard refused to answer, Rahul began screaming that the man needed to give him the guest book right now that would show him when visitors arrived and left. But again, the guard refused. As Rahul got more and more angry with this guard, the guard finally just began threatening to call the police. At which point, Rahul threw up his hands in disgust, spun around, and marched straight through the small crowd of onlookers on the sidewalk who had stopped to watch the fight to get to his car. Rahul got into the driver's seat, slammed the door, gunned the engine, and screeched out into the street. Rahul drove to the nearest police station and practically shouted the whole strange story at the officer at the desk. He said his stepmother was hiding his fiancée and someone had to accompany him back to her penthouse building to help him get some answers. 2 constables would return with Rahul to Indrani's penthouse building, but when they got there, they spoke to the same security guard that had been fighting with Rahul, and this security guard assured them that Rahul's fiancée was just fine. The only issue here was Rahul. At this, the constables decided there had been no crime committed and told Rahul they were leaving. Rahul followed them back to the station, where he still attempted to file a missing person report with them, but they told him to just calm down and stop worrying. Sheena was not his wife, and clearly she had left on her own. She was not missing. The officers told Rahul that if he really wanted to file a missing person report, he should go to a different police station to see if they would do that for him. Furious that he was not being taken seriously, Rahul left the station and climbed back into his car. Once inside, he called Sheena, Indrani, and Peter over and over and over again, but none of them answered. So Rahul did what the officers had just suggested. He drove to a different police station, one that was closer to his own apartment, and he went inside to try to explain what was going on. But these police officers had a very similar reaction to Rahul's story, and they too refused to take a police report on what they believed was just a messy breakup. Rahul didn't know what else to do, so he drove home and spent the day calling around to see if anyone knew anything about where Sheena was or who she was with or what she was doing, but no one he spoke to knew anything. Finally, though, that evening, Rahul got his father, Peter, on the phone. Rahul didn't know it, but Indrani had been keeping Peter fully updated on her plan to get Sheena not just out of her relationship with Rahul, but out of the country altogether to start a new life in America. And Peter had been supportive. Even though Peter had tried to accept Sheena and Rahul's engagement, he just couldn't. He hated the level of conflict that their relationship brought into the family, and so he was kind of relieved that that relationship was now going to end with Indrani's plan. On the phone, Peter could hear how worked up his son was, and so he hesitated to be too direct about what had really happened with Sheena to avoid making Rahul even more upset. But after Rahul pressed, Peter did tell him that Sheena really had left of her own accord, and truly she did not want him or anyone else to be in touch with her right now. He told his son that if he really wanted to talk more about Sheena, he should just come visit him, Peter, in the beach town south of Mumbai where he was staying. But Rahul was not interested in visiting his father. Instead, the next day, Rahul went to yet another police station to try to get their help in figuring out what happened to Sheena. But again, those officers refused to help. But this did not stop Rahul. He wound up calling his mother, who was living in a resort town to the north at the time, and he told her that Indrani must be hiding Sheena or something like that. He just knew it, there was something wrong. And Rahul's mother, who was very sympathetic to her son, flew to Mumbai, and once she was there, she and Rahul would go to the police, and together they would try to convince them to file a report. And this time, the police would finally relent, and they would file a report. However, they did nothing else. They just wrote this report and then forgot about it. But even though the police were not taking him seriously, Rahul was still very much convinced that there was just something off about this whole Sheena situation. He just didn't buy it that Sheena had suddenly left him to be with someone else. And then, a few weeks later, Peter would tell Rahul that Sheena had finally called him. Peter would tell his son that Sheena had actually left and gone to America, and she had arrived, she was safe, she was okay, and again, she just wanted to be left alone. But this news did not create closure for Rahul. It only upset him more, because he didn't believe it. Peter tried to calm his son down, but Rahul just was not listening. He became more and more aggressive towards Peter and Indrani, who he believed were hiding something from him. To Indrani, Rahul's behavior was simply obsessive, and proof that she had made the right decision to step in and help her younger sister get away from him. And Indrani had seen this kind of dangerous, obsessive behavior from Rahul before. A few years earlier, in 2009, not long after Sheena and Rahul had first moved in together, and when Sheena's friends began to notice changes in Sheena's behavior, Indrani had tried to separate Sheena and Rahul. Indrani had been worried about Sheena's mental health, and she had gone to their flat and persuaded Sheena to come with her back to their hometown of Guwahati. And once they got there, Indrani had gotten Sheena set up in a flat of her own and gotten her to see some doctors who put Sheena on medication to combat her depression. But just as Indrani believed Sheena was starting to stabilize, Rahul had suddenly showed up at Sheena's new apartment in Guwahati to take Sheena back to Mumbai. Indrani tried to get Sheena to stay, but ultimately Sheena would go back with Rahul. And it was shortly after their return to Mumbai that Sheena's friends would see her and Rahul snorting cocaine at a nightclub. So now, after Indrani had finally gotten Sheena out of the country altogether away from Rahul, she was determined not to let Rahul ruin this again. So, anytime Rahul called, Indrani and Peter continued to share no information about Sheena's new life, and they would not give up her new contact information. And they remained steadfast in their decision even after one very emotional call in June of 2012 when Rahul said that this whole situation with Sheena had left him so brokenhearted and hopeless that it felt like he was going to die. As for Sheena, she seemed to be doing well. As the months went on, she started slowly opening back up again. She sent emails to some friends telling them she was happy and safe and attending college to get her master's degree in business. She emailed her brother, Mikhail, asking him to take care of some paperwork issues she had left unfinished in Mumbai. Mikhail had actually been in Mumbai in April of 2012, but he had suddenly fallen ill on the same night Indrani and Sheena had met for dinner and returned home to Guwahati without seeing Sheena. He hadn't known she was leaving the country, but the siblings had sort of drifted apart since Sheena had come to Mumbai, so Mikhail just handled the paperwork and didn't pry into her personal life or her breakup with Rahul. The one person Sheena did not reach out to after she left India was Rahul. She just was not ready yet. And finally, after 4 months of phone calls and searching and fighting with Peter and Indrani, Rahul seemed to accept Sheena's decision. He moved out of Mumbai and back in with his mother in a city in northern India in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. The neighbors soon noticed that Rahul seemed reclusive and strange. He didn't have a job and he didn't really come outside much, except to go to a nearby forest. He also seemed to be drinking a lot and using drugs. But from Indrani and Peter's perspective, this was actually an improvement. At least Rahul was finally leaving Sheena and them alone. But in March of 2013, almost a year after Sheena left for America, she sent Peter a troubling email. In this email, Sheena told Peter that Rahul had been scheming to break up his marriage to Indrani and that she herself had gone along with his plan because she loved Rahul. Sheena said that she felt terrible guilt over this because she owed Indrani so much. But now that she was living on her own and was able to reflect on everything without Rahul's bad influence, it was time to come clean about this. Sheena told Peter in her email that ever since Peter's divorce from Rahul's mother, Rahul and his mother had held a deep grudge against Peter. Sheena's email ended with a warning to Peter. Watch your back around Rahul. He wants to destroy you. By 2015, 3 years after Sheena left for America, things with Rahul and Sheena and Peter and Indrani seemed to have finally calmed down. Peter had heeded Sheena's warning about Rahul, and he had been careful around his son, but Rahul had mostly withdrawn anyway and spent most of his time in the forest near his mother's home. And Peter's marriage to Indrani was now stronger than ever because they weren't fighting anymore about Sheena and Rahul. Sheena still sent occasional emails to Indrani, keeping her updated about her life in America, but she had never gotten back in touch with Rahul, which to Indrani and Peter seemed to be for the best. And Indrani and Sheena's brother, Mikhail, was finally doing well too. He had a good job with an airline and a nice life in Guwahati. All in all, things seemed pretty good. But everything was about to change. On August 21st, 2015, the police in Mumbai made what should have been a very minor arrest. Officers were performing a routine patrol when they stopped a driver. It was Indrani's driver, the same one who drove that silver car Sheena was in the last time Rahul saw Sheena. The police searched Indrani's driver's car and found an illegal pistol, so they arrested him. But the driver really did not want to go to prison, and so he told the police that he had a story they might be interested in hearing. But he said he would only tell it if they agreed not to prosecute him. And when the police heard what the driver's story was about, they agreed right away. So they put Indrani's driver in an interview room with detectives, and the man just started talking. And what he had to say would change everything that everyone thought they knew about Sheena. When the detectives finally left the interview room where the driver had just poured out his whole story over the course of a couple hours, they knew exactly what they needed. Just one single piece of paper. An old police report that some uninterested police officer wrote years ago and stuck in a drawer and forgot about. Detectives searched for this report for days. They emptied filing cabinets that nobody had opened for years. They cleaned out empty desks. They tore apart closets. Nobody had ever followed up on this report after the day it was written, and it wasn't even clear that anybody had actually saved it. But then, detectives did find it. And on this police report was the name that detectives were looking for. At 4 a.m. on August 28, 2015, 3 years after Sheena left for America, and 7 days after Indrani's driver told police in Mumbai his story, the phone rang at the home of a man named Ganesh Patil. It was the Mumbai police calling. They told Ganesh they needed him to get out of bed right now and meet them in the forest. Ganesh was a 39-year-old father of 2 who lived in a tiny rural village about 50 miles outside of Mumbai. He worked 3 jobs to support his family. He decorated tents with flowers for weddings, he pulled a rickshaw, and he served as a kind of informal deputy for police. Basically, he helped the police when they had some specific local issue they needed to solve. The village where Ganesh lived was located in a district called Raigad. Raigad includes about 35 tiny little villages, but it's mostly forest, very dense forest. And in this forest, not only is it easy to get turned around and lost, it's also just plain dangerous. There are fast-moving rivers and deep gorges that seem to appear out of nowhere, and on top of that, this forest is known as, quote, Mumbai's dumping ground because people go there to commit suicide and bury bodies of people they have murdered. And because the entire district has only 2 police officers, the vast majority of crimes in this area don't get investigated. So even when bodies are discovered in this forest, police just pay the villagers to bury the bodies where they were found. When the police called Ganesh early that morning, they asked him to lead them right now to a particular spot in that forest. It was at the bottom of a hill where mangoes grow. Ganesh did not ask any questions. He knew what this was about. By 6 a.m. that morning, Ganesh was walking down a muddy, sloping path through the forest. In the past, when he came here to gather mangoes, he was alone. But now he was being followed by a horde of police officers who were all carrying shovels and bright lights. No one spoke as they walked. All Ganesh could hear were the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, and the trudging of lots of boots and the clanging of metal equipment. Ganesh finally got to the bottom of a hill near some mango trees, and he came to a stop. He looked around for a moment, and then he pointed out in front of him at this area where the vegetation was just a little bit thinner, and he said, "There, dig there." The police behind him surged forward with their equipment and started hacking at the ground. Ganesh just stood there and watched in silence. A few minutes later, the police had found what they were looking for. The following is what really happened on April 24th, 2012, which was Sheena's last day in Mumbai. It has been reconstructed from the evidence and confessions that police gathered, starting when Indrani's driver said he wanted to talk. On April 24th, Rahul dropped Sheena off on Linking Road at about 6:30 p.m. After she got out of the car, Sheena told him that she loved him and would see him later on, and then she turned and walked toward the fancy silver sedan where Indrani was waiting with her driver. But when Sheena got into the back seat of that car, it wasn't just Indrani and her driver. There was a third person who was in the car in the front passenger seat. Sheena was a little taken aback and hesitated just for a second, but then climbed into the car and shut the door behind her. Moments later, the driver had climbed into the car and they were on the move. As they drove along, Indrani, who was sitting next to Sheena in the back seat, handed Sheena a glass that contained a sparkly liquid. Sheena was always polite, so she took the glass, said thank you, and took a sip. It was champagne. As the car rolled along, Sheena looked out the window. The colorful outdoor stores of Bora whizzed past and then disappeared behind them as the driver steered the car west towards an area of Bora called Pali Hill, which is very wealthy and has beautiful twisting roads and a handful of isolated cul-de-sacs. Sheena was excited. Indrani had said they were going to buy her a diamond ring. But as the car zoomed along, Sheena started to feel a strange warmth spreading through her body, and her head was starting to feel just a little bit foggy. Sheena blinked her eyes and shook her head, but the feeling didn't go away. At first, Sheena was confused. She opened her mouth to ask the driver to turn up the air conditioner, but her mouth felt dry and her tongue felt thick and her voice was soft and slurred. She couldn't get the words out. She could feel the car taking lots of turns, but her vision was starting to blur and she couldn't quite tell where they were. She felt the empty champagne glass slip out of her fingers and heard it clink softly on the floor of the car. Nobody moved to pick it up. She was starting to get scared. Eventually, Sheena's whole body felt tingly and hot. Outside the car, the sun was setting and it was getting dark. Sheena was trying to keep her eyes open, but they felt so heavy. She could feel the car starting to slow down, and she was dimly aware of the fact that the 3 other people riding in the car with her were just staring at her in silence. Finally, she just leaned her head against the window, she closed her eyes, and she fell asleep. Then she woke up to the feeling of intense pressure everywhere on her body. When she opened her eyes, her vision was still blurry and she was seeing stars, but she could tell she was no longer sitting upright. She was now on her back in the back seat of the car, and someone was sitting on her chest with their legs on either side of her body. Sheena tried to roll to the side, but she could feel 2 fists tangled in her hair, pulling hard and keeping her head from moving. Someone's hand was also smashed down over her mouth. Everything seemed to be happening so fast. Sheena was terrified, but she couldn't even tell where everyone in the car was or what they were doing. Her arms were wrenched up over her head, and when she tried to pull away from whoever was holding her, they just dug their fingers into her wrists, and she could feel fingernails cutting into her skin. And then Sheena felt 2 hands wrap themselves around her throat. She started kicking furiously, her feet hitting the backseat door and window, and her knees were bumping up against the back of the person who was sitting on her chest, but the hands around her throat only squeezed harder and harder. She tried to twist her head, but the hand over her mouth kept her pinned, so she bit down as hard as she could on it. Sheena tasted blood, and the hand on her mouth came off. For a second, it looked like she might have a chance. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. All she could get out was a little cough. It was too late. She had no more air and she couldn't breathe in anymore. Sheena opened and closed her mouth uselessly. She couldn't see anything anymore. Her vision was just a combination of blackness and random bursts of light. And then finally, her eyes closed. Sheena never went to America. She died in the back seat of that fancy silver sedan just about an hour after Rahul dropped her off on Linking Road. The prosecution of the people accused of killing Sheena has been going on now for 7 years, and it has gripped the country. However, nobody has been convicted yet. But the following is the story of the murder of Sheena Bora that has emerged from all of the witness testimony and documents presented in court and in the media so far. But again, until there is a conviction, all the crimes I'm going to describe here are just allegations. The person who climbed onto Sheena's chest in the backseat of that car and wrapped their hands around her throat was Indrani, Sheena's overprotective older sister. But as detectives dug deeper, it would turn out that nothing in Indrani's life was as it seemed. And Sheena wasn't who everyone thought she was either. It would turn out Indrani was not Sheena's older sister. She was actually Sheena's mother. Sheena had never wanted to lie about her relationship with Indrani, and she had never wanted to leave Rahul. She loved Rahul, but Indrani had forced her to lie. In fact, Indrani had created an elaborate set of lies and fake personas to trick everyone in her life, including Sheena, and she had been doing it for years, starting with the story that Indrani told everybody about her own life. The city of Mumbai, where Indrani and Peter were considered one of the most powerful and glamorous media couples, knew Indrani as a beautiful and almost tragic figure. She had told everyone that her father died when she was a child, and her mother married her uncle, who abused her. So she said she fled her hometown of Guwahati, leaving her brother and sister, Mikhail and Sheena, behind. She got married, but she said her husband beat her, so she left him and finally found true love with Peter. And once Indrani had built her life with Peter, she told everyone that she went back to Guwahati and rescued her brother and sister. So when Sheena appeared in Mumbai, everyone thought that Indrani was generous and selfless and loyal. But almost none of that was true. Indrani actually grew up spoiled by her parents, who were both still alive. Indrani had Sheena when she was about 17 years old, and then Mikhail a year and a half later. And Indrani hated taking care of those two babies. So one day, she just left. And once Indrani was out of Guwahati, it was like her kids, Sheena and Mikhail, didn't exist. She just started her life over again. She got married to a rich businessman, but she got tired of him quickly, so she divorced him and moved to Mumbai, where she married Peter, who was much more rich and famous. And this is how Sheena came back into Indrani's life. Indrani's parents back in Guwahati were raising Sheena and Mikhail, and their financial situation was just getting worse and worse. Then they saw a photograph of Indrani in the news with Peter, and so they called Indrani right away and said, "You need to help us out financially." Indrani didn't want any connection with Sheena or Mikhail, and she was furious that her parents had reached out at all, but she also didn't want anyone to know that she had two kids from her teenage years that she had abandoned, or that her whole life story was a lie. All Indrani wanted was to keep her secret family back in Guwahati quiet, so she knew she had to do what they wanted. At first, Indrani just sent money. But then, as Sheena and Mikhail grew up and they became more expensive, Indrani's parents demanded more money. And that was how Indrani wound up bringing Sheena to Mumbai in 2006 under a very strict agreement that Sheena was going to tell everyone that Indrani was her sister, not her mother. And it was an agreement that Sheena kept, but it made her incredibly depressed. When Sheena and Rahul fell in love, Indrani wasn't really worried about Rahul being a bad influence on Sheena, even though that's what she told people. Instead, Indrani was just afraid that if Sheena and Rahul got married, they would cut her, Indrani, out of Peter's huge fortune. And even worse, Indrani was afraid that Sheena would expose her secret identity. So when Sheena and Rahul moved in together, Indrani made her first attempt to separate them. In 2009, Indrani had come to Sheena and Rahul's flat and convinced Sheena to come with her back to Guwahati. She took Sheena to see some doctors and convinced the doctors to prescribe Sheena very heavy psychiatric medication that would make Sheena very sleepy and confused basically all of the time. But Rahul showed up in Guwahati and effectively rescued Sheena from Indrani. Indrani told people that this incident showed that Rahul had too much power over Sheena. But what it really showed was that Indrani was going to have to do something much more drastic to get Sheena out of the picture, and she would do just that. After Sheena and Rahul got engaged at the end of 2011, Indrani started reaching out to Sheena so she could pretend to repair their relationship. In March 2012, when Sheena wrote to Indrani saying she was sorry they fought so much, Indrani wrote back telling Sheena she would always love her. Then Indrani started trying to get Sheena to meet her for dinner, offering to buy her a diamond ring and pay for her to rent a 3-bedroom apartment. Then Indrani created a fake email address under Sheena's name and sent herself an email from this fake account pretending to be Sheena. That was the email that Indrani showed to Peter that said Sheena was desperate to get out of this relationship with Rahul. Later, Indrani would send her husband, Peter, another fake email from Sheena, the one he received in 2013, warning him to watch his back around Rahul. As for that phone call that Peter would receive from Sheena, telling him she was in America and doing just fine, that was obviously not Sheena, that was Indrani's secretary. So, once Indrani got Sheena to agree to meet her for dinner, she turned her attention to her other child, Mikhail. By this point, Indrani had decided she would need to murder her son as well as Sheena in order to make sure her lies wouldn't be exposed. So she contacted Mikhail and asked him to come visit her in Mumbai on April 24th. Mikhail didn't really want to, but Indrani was paying for everything in his life, so he agreed. On April 24th, 2012, Indrani set her murderous plan in motion. She had summoned her first husband, the one she had divorced, who was still for some reason very loyal to her, to come help her. And she had paid her driver for his silence. She bought sedatives, liquor, and a suitcase and rented a car. Then, around 6:30 p.m. that night, a couple of hours before Mikhail was sent to land, Indrani, her first husband, and her driver pulled up on Linking Road in Bandra to meet Sheena. When Sheena climbed into the car, she found Indrani sitting in the back seat and Indrani's first husband in the front passenger seat. Sheena was confused by the presence of Indrani's first husband, but she knew him and she wasn't afraid of him, so she didn't feel too worried. When Indrani handed Sheena a glass of champagne spiked with the sedatives, Sheena didn't suspect anything and she drank it happily. When the sedatives took effect and Sheena fell asleep, Indrani knew it was time to act. She told her driver to pull over on a deserted cul-de-sac, and then Indrani's first husband climbed into the back seat with her, and then all at once, they sprung on Sheena, who was laying on her back on the seats. Indrani's first husband grabbed Sheena by the hair, while the driver reached back and gagged her mouth. Indrani herself climbed on top of her child's chest and straddled her, and then started to strangle her. The sudden violence woke Sheena up, and she started fighting. She kicked and she bit the driver's thumb, but it was no use. Slowly, Indrani strangled the life out of her daughter. When Sheena finally stopped moving, Indrani just stared down at her without any emotion on her face. At this point, Indrani took Sheena's cell phone and sent a text to Rahul pretending to be Sheena. She told him in this text that Sheena was going to be spending the night with Indrani. And the next morning, it would be Indrani again pretending to be Sheena, who texted Rahul to say that Sheena had fallen in love with someone else and was leaving him. Indrani and her accomplices didn't dispose of Sheena's body right away. They propped it up in the silver car and made their way back to Indrani's apartment, where they parked in the garage and then stuffed Sheena's body into a suitcase Indrani had bought for this reason, and then they left the suitcase hidden in the garage. It was late by the time Indrani got upstairs to her penthouse, accompanied by her first husband. Mikhail, whose flight had landed that night, was waiting impatiently inside. When Indrani greeted him, she was unusually kind and interested in his life, asking him lots of questions about his job. Then she handed him a drink, the same spiked drink that she had just given to Sheena. But unlike Sheena, when Mikhail started to feel woozy, he became suspicious. He stopped drinking it and he didn't pass out. Indrani got frustrated and told him to go to bed, but instead, Mikhail left for the airport. He was completely sick, but he was able to get a ticket and get out of town. A few hours after Mikhail left Indrani's penthouse, Indrani decided it was now time to get rid of Sheena's body. She went down to the garage and she pulled the suitcase out of hiding. She was worried about being stopped at a checkpoint and having the luggage examined, so she pulled Sheena out of the suitcase and carefully brushed and styled Sheena's hair. She put makeup on her, she sprayed her with perfume, then she sat her up in the back seat of the car like she was a living passenger. Then Indrani, her first husband, and her driver piled into the car as well and began driving to where Indrani wanted to dump Sheena's body, the forest in Raigad. As they drove, Indrani sat in the back seat next to her daughter, Sheena, whose head rested on Indrani's shoulder. Once they got to the forest, the driver, Indrani, and her first husband together dragged Sheena's body out into the woods, where they smashed her body with rocks and then lit it on fire. A month later, on May 23, 2012, Ganesh Patil, the man from Raigad who worked as a deputy for local police, discovered Sheena's body. When Ganesh contacted the police about it, an officer wrote the report that detectives would frantically search for 3 years later after Indrani's driver confessed. But at the time of Ganesh's gruesome discovery in May of 2012, the police didn't investigate. They just paid villagers to bury the body where it lay. And where the body lay was where Ganesh had taken police in the early morning hours of August 2015. right at the bottom of a hill near where the mangoes grow. Indrani was arrested and charged with murder, along with her first husband. As for her second husband, Peter, he was also arrested a short time later and charged with murder, though he has denied knowing anything about Indrani's plans and claims that he too was tricked. Indrani, for her part, denies murdering Sheena and says that Sheena is not even dead. She says that Sheena is alive and well and living in America. The driver has testified in court against Indrani and Peter in exchange for immunity. Indrani's first husband was initially said to have confessed, but now says he's innocent. Peter and Indrani, who are now divorced, are out of jail as the trial drags along. As for Rahul, he has said he doesn't believe his father, Peter, was involved in what happened to Sheena. This case continues to shock and horrify the people of India, and stories about it appear in the news almost every day. On October 9, 2010, 2-year-old Rowan Griffin was in the backseat of the car next to his two older siblings, and his father was driving the car. And they were on their way to this big family party at Rowan's grandparents' house. They lived in Richmond, New Hampshire, which is a pretty rural part of New Hampshire, and their house was literally in the woods. You had to go down this really long driveway to get to it, and it was this single-story home where they had cleared out all the trees in the backyard to kind of clear a space to have these awesome cookouts for family get-togethers. And so Rowan, his two siblings, and his dad, they get to the entrance of the driveway that's going to bring them up to the house, and they can already tell there's tons of people here because there's cars lining the driveway all the way out to the street. And so they make their way up the driveway, and sure enough, right in the backyard is just a sea of adults and teenagers and kids. It's this huge family reunion, and Rowan and his two siblings just take off running to go play with their cousins. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids were just running around having a great time, and the adults are having a good time. And at some point, the adults started to notice, after the fact, they would say they noticed this, they started to notice Rowan was chasing a cat. There was a cat that lived at the grandparents' house, and he loved the cat, and he was chasing it all around the backyard. And at some point, Rowan ran into the woods to chase after this cat. And a number of adults saw him do that, but it was like mob mentality, where they each thought somebody else was watching Rowan. They were not trying to be negligent. They just figured there's so many people here, what can go wrong? In a very short period of time, Mr. Griffin realizes he can't find his son. And so he goes to the kids and he's like, hey, have you seen Rowan? And they're like, oh yeah, I think he was chasing a cat. I think he was over there. And then Mr. Griffin asks the adults and they say the same thing. Yeah, he's chasing a cat. I think he was over there. And after looking around for him and everybody basically saying he was chasing this cat and not being able to find him, he just started yelling to the group, hey, everybody stop for a second. I can't find Rowan. Everyone's telling me he's chasing a cat. Well, then can you tell me where he went? I don't know where he is. And pretty quickly they realize he's not in the house. He's not in the backyard. He's not at the end of the driveway. He's not in any of the cars. He's not here. And very quickly, the group started yelling for Rowan. They're running out into the woods. They're looking for him. And Mr. Griffin is like, I don't know how long he's been gone for. And so he calls 911 right then and there. He's not taking any chances. And so the police come out and they launch this huge search. And then all these locals in the area that had ATVs and four-wheelers, they came out and they're driving around the forest looking for Rowan. Everybody's yelling for him. There's hundreds of people out there. But as the sun started to fade, they still hadn't found him. They had found no indication of where he went. They assumed he made it out into the forest because the last sign of him was he was chasing a cat into the forest potentially, but they really didn't know. And so finally the sun does go down that night and they have to postpone the search until first light the next morning. And you can only imagine how horrible that was for Rowan's parents as they're sitting inside that night wondering what's happening to their 2-year-old son who's just out in the woods by himself. So very early the next morning, a whole bunch of volunteers went right back out into the woods to look for Rowan. There was this one particular group that wanted to look a little bit farther away than where everybody else was looking. They were going to be about 3+ miles away in this swamp. And so this group of searchers, they start walking into this swamp and they can tell right away that it's a very wet and deep swamp. They would take a step onto something that looked solid and they would sink 2-3 feet into the water. They all had waders on so they wouldn't get wet. But they were basically sludging through the swamp and it was very thick. And at some point they make their way through a clearing and they see on a log what looks like a pair of children's shoes, or shoes for sure. They look small enough to be kids. And so they wade their way over and they climb up onto this dry section of land and they walk over and sure enough, they're kids' shoes. And so they yell out for him a couple times and then they stop to listen. And after a minute, they hear him call back. He's yelling, "Here!" And they walk their way past this huge bush and they look through and they can't believe it. They see Rowan right in the middle of this bog of water. There is a tree that is right in the middle of this, and he's clutched onto the tree. He looks dry, he looks okay, and he's just standing on this island holding this tree. And so immediately the searchers jump right in the water and they start wading their way out to this island where Rowan is. And the whole time they're going out there, the water's, up to their chest, and they're looking around, and it's at least that deep all the way around this thing. And they're looking up at the kid, and he's bone dry, and he's 2 years old. So they don't know if he knows how to swim or not. And so they're thinking to themselves, how did he get out here? But either way, they're like, let's just get the kid and bring him back to his parents. And so they finally hop up onto this island and they kind of look over Rowan. He seems okay. They pick him up, they keep him out of the water, and they bring him back to land and back to his parents. Initially, Rowan's parents and the police and the searchers, everybody is just so happy that Rowan is alive that no one is asking any questions about, what happened and, what's the deal with you being found on that island? How'd you get out there? People are just leaving it alone. They're just happy he's here. But after the dust had settled, so to speak, Rowan's parents would ask him some questions. They would say, what happened? How'd you get lost? And how'd you get on that island? And at first, Rowan was just not saying anything, but eventually he would say that there were cows out there. And he said that he was scared of the cows, and that's why he went to the island, because he wanted to get away from the cows. Now, there were no cows in that swamp or anywhere near where he was that night. So either he didn't see anything and he was hallucinating seeing animals at all, or he was mislabeling something else that he was seeing. But whatever he was seeing or believed he was seeing, it scared the heck out of him, and he would get really frightened when he would talk about these cows. But regardless of what he saw or didn't see, the million-dollar question is, how did he get out to that island? Because in order to get out to that island, for him, being a 2-year-old, being the size he was, he would have had to swim. The water was too deep all the way around the island, and he didn't know how to swim. But even if he had found a way to magically swim out to this island, why wasn't he wet? It's also worth noting this all took place just a few miles away from the infamous Bennington Triangle, which is this area in southern Vermont where there's been a whole string of people going missing under very mysterious circumstances. In 1953, 11-year-old Jerry Monkman was considered a very frail child. He was skinnier than his peers, he was shorter than his peers, and he had a really bad case of asthma, which was a breathing condition that made doing anything physical really difficult. But despite his perceived fragility, he loved going outside, he loved hiking, and he was a proud member of the Boy Scouts. And so on April 25th of that year, Jerry was really excited when he found out his Boy Scout troop was offering a trip to the Rocky Mountain foothills to go camping and hiking for a weekend, and he jumped at the opportunity. So Jerry, his troop, and his troop leaders, they all pile in a van and they make their way up to the Rocky Mountains, and as soon as they get there, they go on this wickedly rugged hike up in the Teton Canyon, and about an hour into their trip, one of the troop leaders turns around and Jerry's gone. The troop leaders did not know how long he had been gone for, so they only searched for a couple of minutes before one of them ran down the mountain to try to get help. Soon the sheriff's department arrived and 1,600 volunteers from the town that had heard about this, they all poured out onto the mountain, and they are combing across this mountain to find Jerry as quickly as possible. But after several hours, they couldn't find him, and people started to think the worst. And then just then, the bloodhound they had brought out to try to track his scent picked up Jerry's scent, and it starts taking off up the trail. And the handler of the dog tells everyone, hey, he's picked him up, we're gonna find him, we're gonna find him. And he thinks the dog's gonna lead him to him, within a mile or so of where they are. But the dog just stays on a complete beeline for 6 hours. It just tracks straight north for 6 hours until it comes to this big swamp where it stops. Like, I found it. This is where it ends. This swamp was 12 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. So the handler and the people that had followed this dog, they searched the swamp because even though they thought it was totally improbable that Jerry, this frail 11-year-old with asthma, would have maneuvered 12 miles uphill through rugged terrain to the swamp, they still felt like they needed to search it. So they searched the swamp. There wasn't anything there. And so the dog handler's thinking, okay, my dog must have made a mistake. And so he gives the scent again to the dog, thinking the dog will turn and start heading back towards where Jerry had gone missing. But instead, his dog basically just reconfirms that, nope, This is where the scent brought me. I'm still right. And so the dog handler and everybody else that had made this long, treacherous 12-mile journey up to the swamp, they just decided that the dog must have made a mistake and the kid could never have been here. The next morning at 8 a.m., an 8-year-old boy named David was riding his horse about 30 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. And he happened to be looking over at the tree line, and a boy stumbles out of the tree line and waves to him. And so David goes over, and it turns out it's Jerry Monkman. Jerry would just tell David that he needs to get back to his group. And David would say, what are you doing out here? And Jerry just said, I don't really know. I need to get back to my group. I was with a group yesterday, and I need to get back to them. And apparently David asked him, well, how did you get here if you were with them yesterday? And all Jerry could say was, I fell asleep under a tree. I don't know. When word got back to the searchers that they had found Jerry and they had found him 30 miles away, they couldn't believe it. The day before, it had been unbelievable that he could have traveled 12 miles to that swamp. Like literally unbelievable. They didn't believe it. Nope, he couldn't have done it. And now clearly he's traveled at least 30 miles to have been found by David where he was found. And that's 30 miles as the crow flies, meaning overhead air miles, 30 miles. The reality is when you're walking in the wilderness, you don't walk in straight lines. You make turns and you go left, there's switchbacks. And the area he must have gone through over those 30 miles is all unmarked. It's this rugged, hilly, awful, unmarked terrain. So for sure, he probably covered 40 plus miles to get there. And so the police asked him, how did you do this? How did you cover the distance you covered in such a short amount of time? And Jerry would say he just remembers sleeping under a tree and then waking up, and he would see animals poking their heads around from behind different trees. And he didn't know what kind of animals they were, but they were watching him, and he was worried they were going to hurt him, but they didn't. And he said he was able to just keep walking, and he would keep sleeping under these trees, and he kept seeing these animals that were watching him, and he just kept saying, they never hurt me. They never hurt me. And so obviously this did not answer any of the questions that the investigators were looking to answer, and they just felt like, okay, maybe he's in shock, and we can ask him at another time. But the theory became like, well, then he must have been abducted to have covered this distance. But that begs the question, who's capable of moving an 11-year-old that much distance in such a short amount of time? We're talking about a 30-hour window, moving potentially 50 plus miles, lugging an 11-year-old around. And then even if there was someone or something that was capable of lifting up an 11-year-old and maneuvering them that much distance in such a short amount of time, well, to what end? Why would they do that? Why was Jerry then maneuvered to the swamp and then maneuvered to where he was found? It doesn't make any sense. One of the most remote places in the world is Buldir Island in Alaska. It's 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away. The weather on Buldir Island is pretty brutal, especially during the winter, and there's no electricity there. In 1944, the United States Army decided they wanted to send 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on Buldir Island. That was like the one thing the island was used for. And so one of the people that was sent on this assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was born in Wisconsin and worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate Alaskan island really appealed to him, and he was excited about the assignment. In October of that year, Bud was flown out to Buldir Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers that were going to be living on the island with him. It was going to be those 5 on the island. No one else is there. And they quickly learned their job of monitoring the weather station was a very low effort job. And so they could do all of their tasks over the course of the day pretty easily. And it freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island. And that would actually become their favorite pastime because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. And so very quickly they became very familiar with the whole island because it wasn't that big. It was about maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, so 5 months after they've arrived on Buldir Island. So by now they know every square inch of the island. They're very comfortable here. They had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so very routine. And all 5 of them are sitting in the weather station, and Bud says he'll do it. So Bud gets his rifle and he heads outside to do this patrol. And the other four are just sitting in the weather station. And after about an hour, they realize Bud hasn't come back yet. And this patrol does not take more than 20 minutes. And so they step outside to see if he's out there. And the weather at the time was very mild. You know, there's no snow on the ground. It's not very cold. It's not very windy. And the visibility this night was pretty good. And so they're looking out over the island, and the island has no trees. At the very far end, at the opposite end of where the weather station is, there's one significant sized mountain. But short of that, it's not particularly mountainous. So from their perspective, they could look out over the island and basically see everything, and they don't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it because they figure, you know what, he knows what he's doing. He's been here so long. He's probably just out exploring or something. But they decided they would go look for him. They go down to the water. He's not down there. They walk all around the far side of the island. They can't find him. And so by the time they get back to the weather station, they were like, we have to tell the command that we've lost him. So they radio back to higher command and they say, we don't know where he went. He went out on patrol and we didn't hear anything. And now he's gone. And so a whole bunch of reinforcements came out to the island to look on foot with the other four soldiers, as well as planes and helicopters. And for 2 days, they looked all over that island for Bud, and they couldn't find him. And you got to remember that there's very few places you could possibly even go on the island that they wouldn't be able to look and see you. And so everyone started to think he must have jumped into the water or fallen into the water, because there's nowhere for him to hide on the island. And so after a couple of days, they were so sure that it was just not possible for him to be on the island that they called the search off and they said he must have fallen into the water. Fast forward 40 years to 1988, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was studying birds on Bull Deer Island, and they made this amazing discovery. This crew had set up their camp at 1,600 feet of elevation on the one large mountain on the far side of the island, basically on the opposite end of the island from the weather station. And one of the crew members happened to just walk around one of the boulders, and they looked down and there was this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground, and he thought he saw something inside of it. And he got down and he looked and he realized there was a skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny little tight space. And the skeleton had a military uniform on. It had been kind of balled up, but there was a uniform on what was left of the skeleton, and there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. And it would turn out to be Bud Houston. So why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do that patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do that and then walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 1,500 feet to the top of this mountain? But even if he had a reason to be over there, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice? If he was looking for shelter, well, the weather was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even that second night. And he knows the island like the back of his hand. He probably had a little bit more time. He probably could have found a better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a place where he was seeking shelter under these boulders instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real shelter, then he had to have been in an emergency situation. That's the only way that makes sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility is not just to survive, it's also to be found again and to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so no one can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place to be found. There's no trees. There was helicopters overhead and planes, and there's all these people. It's a small space. All he had to do was not be under the boulder 24/7. Maybe during the day when the weather let up, roll out from under the boulder. Let yourself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself. So someone else had to do it. But all the other people on the island were in the weather station at the time this would have been happening. So it really makes you wonder, what happened when he walked outside of that weather station? Who or what did he see, and what did they do to him? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you... If you enjoyed today's stories, let me know in the comments if you found the secret. Tell us what it is and where you found it. Give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak up behind the like button and viciously rear naked choke them. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for